Shalom, good evening. This is TV7 Israel News broadcast to you from Jerusalem, and in today's top stories. Tensions are seemingly on the rise on Israel's southern front with the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. Israeli Prime Minister Beniamin Netanyahu travels to New York for the annual UN General Assembly. Germany, France, and Britain announced their intention to maintain sanctions on Iran regardless of any looming sunsets under the JCPOA and the Security Council Resolution 2231. Tensions are mounting on Israel's southern front with the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. Before the start of the high holiday season in Israel, which included the feast of Rosh Hashanah that marked the beginning of the Hebrew calendar's New Year on Friday Eve, a security assessment by Jerusalem's top defense brass culminated with a decision to impose a 3-day closure of the Gaza-Israel border. With that being said, the IDF stressed in a statement that transit would be made possible only in humanitarian, medical, or exceptional cases. Meanwhile, despite having access to Egypt via the Gaza Strip's Rafah border crossing, free from any Israeli interference, Hamas instructed its operatives to ratchet up daily riots along the enclave's border with Israel. And while these border riots have been propagated by the internationally designated terror group Hamas as, quote, peaceful protests, the rioting operatives have clearly escalated the violence directed at IDF forces that are frustrating any spillovers into Israeli territory. On Friday, violence evidently peaked when those cynically referred to as peaceful demonstrators hurled improvised explosive devices and hand grenades, and in at least one confirmed case opened live fire toward the Israeli forces. And while thankfully no injuries were reported among the Israeli troops, the IDF did not stand idly by. In a retaliatory response aimed at clarifying to Hamas that it would not be able to breach the fragile security calm without bearing the consequences, an IDF aircraft struck a military post belonging to the Hamas terrorist organization during the violent riot that took place adjacent to the security fence in the Gaza Strip. And while the Hamas-controlled health ministry in Gaza failed to report on any injuries in the aerial strike, Israeli reports have indicated to the contrary without providing additional details. Meanwhile, in light of the seeming escalation on Israel's southern front, the Israel-Gaza border has remained closed today, essentially preventing 17,000 Palestinian workers from entering Israel. According to a security official, closing the crossing is meant to send a message to Hamas, a move that bore fruit in previous cycles of border disturbances. Turning to the Mazmoria crossing, which is an entry point from the West Bank district of Judea, adjacent to the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Har Homa, where police said that a Palestinian suspect arrived with clear intent to perpetrate an act of terror at approximately 8 a.m. this morning. The Palestinian suspect, a 47-year-old resident of Bethlehem region, essentially drew a knife and rushed toward border police officers who were stationed at the scene. Nevertheless, the officers immediately responded by opening fire, effectively neutralizing the threat. It is important to know that no injuries were reported among the Israeli troops, while the Palestinian assailant was taken to hospital for further treatment. In other news, the Israeli and Hellenic air forces concluded a joint exercise, which included dozens of fighter jets from various squadrons, refueling tankers, and an Israeli Air Force surveillance aircraft. As part of the exercise, dozens of aircraft took off and flew long-range flights for several hours and thousands of kilometers from Israel to Greek territory and back. In Greece, the fighter jets practiced low-altitude flying and the dropping of live weapons in designated areas. The flight was carried out under particularly challenging weather conditions. Nevertheless, the exercise was deemed successful. According to the IDF spokesperson's unit, the long-range flights were carried out in wing-to-wing cooperation with the Hellenic Air Force while learning from one another and sharing operational knowledge.
Well, are honored to have the Hellenic Air Force join us in flight. This visit aims to further advance our knowledge and cooperation. Two air forces with one common goal, to protect the Mediterranean skies.
It is worth highlighting that the joint exercise with the Hellenic Air Force is a part of a series of exercises and modules that the Israeli Air Force performed in the past year with the goal of improving the operational and mental readiness for long-range flights, refueling, extensive striking, and achieving air superiority, which are crucial capabilities if Jerusalem would ultimately be forced to direct an attack against Iran's nuclear-related infrastructure, among others. Turning to Jerusalem, where Israeli Prime Minister Beniamin Netanyahu attended separate ceremonies over the weekend at the IDF General Staff Forum, the ISA, and the Mossad as part of the traditional toasts ahead of Rosh Hashanah. At all three events, the Israeli premier highlighted the importance of unity while stressing that all must be done to ensure that the Ayatollah regime in Tehran does not fulfill its declared ambitions.
אני מאמין בכם, אני סומך עליכם, אני סומך על היכולת שלנו לגייס את כל המשאבים שעומדים לרשותנו, בצה"ל וגם בזרועות אחרות. בראש ובראשונה את הנחישות שלנו כעם לא לתת לסיפור המופלא שלנו להסתיים אחרי 3,500 שנה על ידי משטר אייתולות קיצוני שיאיים עם נשק גרעיני וטילים בין יבשתיים על העולם כולו.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Beniamin Netanyahu, along with his wife Sarah, traveled to the U.S. city of New York last night, where the Israeli leader is set to meet U.S. President Joe Biden for the first time since assuming office, alongside other world leaders respectively, on the sidelines of the annual summit of the United Nations General Assembly.
אני יוצא עכשיו לעצרת האו"ם, שם אני אייצג את ישראל אל מול אומות העולם. בימים הללו אני גם אפגוש מנהיגים רבים מהעולם, בראשם הנשיא ביידן, שאיתו אדבר בין השאר ובראש ובראשונה על איראן והרחבת מעגל השלום. אני אבקש גם עם קנצלר גרמניה, עם נשיא אוקראינה, עם נשיא טורקיה ומנהיגים רבים נוספים מאסיה, מאירופה, מאפריקה.
Premier Netanyahu also seized the opportunity to respond to Iran's decision to ban multiple inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, from entering the country, a move which the IAEA Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi decried as unprecedented and profoundly regrettable, further hampering on the agency's ability to closely scrutinize Tehran's nuclear activities.
אני חושב שהיום העולם רואה, ואני כמובן אדגיש את זה, שאיראן מפרה את כל ההתחייבויות שלה, שהיא משקרת במצח נחושה, שהיא מתכוונת גם לפתח נשק גרעיני וגם להמשיך את התוקפנות שלה באזור. אנחנו נאבק בשני הדברים הללו גם יחד. שמעתי את האיומים שבאו מאחד מאנשי המשטר האיראני היום. אני מציע לו לא לאיים עלינו, והוא צריך לדעת, והמשטר הזה צריך לדעת, שאנחנו נגיב בעוצמה לכל תקיפה של אנשינו ושל אזרחינו.
Meanwhile, in Washington, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, alongside her host, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, confirmed that Berlin, alongside London and Paris, will maintain sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran, despite the looming expiration date of a UN-sponsored ban on imports and exports of missile-related equipment and technology, alongside sanctions on select proliferation-linked entities. The joint E3 decision was made in response to Iran's defiant nuclear-related activities, irrespective of international law. Secretary Blinken, for his part, seized the opportunity to blame the Trump administration for the failure of the incumbent administration's policy to contain the Islamic Republic's nuclear program, rather than accepting the fact that the Ayatollah regime unabashedly refuses to negotiate in good faith.
We, of course, both of us, many other countries have long-standing concerns about Iran's nuclear program. The agreement that was reached some years ago, the JCPOA, had the very important benefit of putting that program in a box. Unfortunately, in leaving that agreement, we created an opportunity for Iran to get back out of the box that we put it in. And we've now been dealing with some of the consequences of that decision over the last couple of years, including things like enrichment at higher levels, greater accumulation of stockpile of enriched material, etc.
Despite failure to contain the Islamic Republic from racing toward a nuclear weapon via diplomatic means, the Biden administration remains adamant, irrespective of prescribed advice by the intelligence community in the US and elsewhere, that diplomacy could yield their genuine aspiration of thwarting Tehran's nuclear ambitions.
We are determined, President Biden is determined, that Iran will not acquire a nuclear weapon, one way or another. We continue to believe that diplomacy is the most effective way to achieve that result, but there's no active diplomatic engagement on that question right now because of the steps that Iran has taken, as well as its refusal or inability to get back into mutual compliance with the JCPOA.
Thank you for watching TV7 Israel News. Separately, I would like to encourage you, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, the salvation of Israel, and for our persecuted brothers and sisters worldwide. I'm Jonathan Hassan wishing you a Shavua Mevorach, and God willing, we'll see you again tomorrow at the same time.